I want you to think about the last time you paid down a significant chunk of debt. Maybe you threw an extra $500 at your credit card. Maybe you finally knocked out a balance that had been sitting there for months. And for a day, maybe two, you felt genuinely good about it. Proud, even, like things were finally moving in the right direction. And then something happened. Not necessarily something big. Maybe a stressful week at work. Maybe an argument with someone. Maybe just a low, gray, unmotivated Tuesday. And somehow, without quite deciding to, you ended up spending again. Not on anything particularly important. Just spending. And when you checked your balance a week later, a good chunk of that progress was gone. If that cycle sounds familiar, I need you to understand something clearly. That is not a discipline problem. That is not a budgeting problem. That is not even really a money problem. That is an emotional problem wearing the costume of a financial one. And until you understand what's actually driving that cycle, no budget, no debt payoff plan, no spreadsheet in the world is going to break it permanently. My name is John, and I spend way too much time thinking about the psychological and emotional forces that keep people trapped in debt cycles that have almost nothing to do with how much money they make or how well they understand personal finance. If you're someone who has tried to get out of debt, made real progress, and then found yourself back at square one more times than you can count, and you start to wonder whether something deeper is going on, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Because today we're going deep on what I genuinely believe is the most underdiscussed, most misunderstood, and most consequential dimension of personal debt. The emotional and psychological architecture that keeps people in debt long after they have the financial knowledge and even the financial capacity to get out. Let's get into it. Section 1. The debt emotion paradox. Why knowledge is enough. Here's the thing. If you're watching this video, you almost certainly know how debt works. You know that high-interest credit card debt is expensive. You know the math. If you carry a $5,000 balance at 22% APR and only make minimum payments, you'll pay approximately $4,700 in interest over roughly 11 years before the debt is cleared. You know that debt is a drain. You know that paying it off faster saves money. You know all of this, and you're still in debt, or you keep cycling back into it. So what's actually going on? Here's what most people don't realize. According to research published in the Journal of Consumer Psychology, the primary drivers of consumer debt accumulation are not financial ignorance and not income insufficiency. For the majority of people who cycle in and out of debt, the primary drivers are emotional regulation, psychological identity, and what researchers call financial coping behaviors, the use of spending and debt as mechanisms to manage negative emotional states. In other words, for most people in persistent debt, the debt is not primarily about money. It is primarily about emotion. It is a coping mechanism, a way of managing stress, anxiety, boredom, sadness, frustration, or emptiness that happens to have a financial cost. And treating it purely as a financial problem, while ignoring the emotional architecture underneath, is like treating a fever with ice packs without ever addressing the infection causing it. You manage the symptom temporarily. The underlying cause continues to generate the problem. This is where it gets really interesting. Because once you understand that debt is often emotional in nature, the entire framework for addressing it changes. You stop asking, how do I budget better? And start asking, what am I trying to feel or avoid feeling when I spend? That second question is the one that actually leads somewhere. Section 2, the 5 emotional traps, how they actually work. Let me walk you through the 5 most common emotional patterns that keep people in debt. And I want to be precise about each one, because they look similar from the outside but operate very differently internally, and each requires a different response. Emotional trap 1, stress spending. This is the most common and the most well-documented. When humans experience stress, the brain's threat response system activates. Cortisol rises, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for long-term planning and impulse control, goes partially offline, and the limbic system, which drives immediate reward-seeking behavior, takes over. The result is a neurological state that is specifically hostile to good financial decision-making and spending, particularly on small pleasures, food, clothes, entertainment, convenience items, triggers the brain's dopamine reward pathway with near immediate effect. The relief is real. The stress temporarily decreases. The prefrontal cortex comes back online. And the purchase feels in that moment not just justified but genuinely necessary. According to the American Psychological Association's annual Stress in America survey, approximately 33% of Americans report spending money as a primary coping mechanism for stress. Not 5%, not 10%, 1 in 3. And here's the part that makes this particularly insidious. People in higher stress states also demonstrate reduced sensitivity to price and future consequences. They literally become less capable of evaluating the financial impact of their purchases at the exact moment they're most likely to make them. The debt this creates tends to accumulate in small, diffuse increments. $40 here, $80 there, that individually feel justifiable but collectively represent persistent, renewable financial drain tied directly to the person's stress levels, which means the debt doesn't just follow the person's income or their financial habits. It follows their emotional state. Emotional trap 2, retail therapy, the temporary identity boost. This one operates at a deeper level than simple stress relief. It's about identity, about how you see yourself and how you want to be seen. And it gets particularly powerful in periods of low self-esteem, feeling undervalued at work, comparison to others, or a general sense of life not going as planned. Here's what happens neurologically. The act of purchasing, particularly the anticipation of purchasing, activates the brain's reward circuitry in a way that temporarily elevates mood and, crucially, temporarily elevates the sense of personal agency and social status. You feel better about yourself for a brief window after buying something, not because the item changed your circumstances, but because the act of purchasing itself conferred a momentary sense of control, choice, and self-expression in a life that may otherwise feel constrained. Research by consumer psychologist Rick Peters at Tilburg University found that people experiencing feelings of loneliness purchase items specifically to signal identity and belonging to themselves and to others. The purchases are not really about the objects. They are about managing a narrative about who you are and what kind of life you're living. The trap closes because the mood elevation is temporary, typically lasting minutes to hours, while the debt is permanent until paid, which means the same emotional need resurfaces, the same purchasing behavior occurs, and the debt accumulates continuously. Retail therapy treats the symptom while generating a new problem. Emotional trap 3, scarcity thinking, the deserving trap. This one is subtle, and it operates as a kind of emotional overcorrection. It's most common in people who have been disciplined about money, who have been restricting spending, tracking everything, saying no to things, and then experience what researchers call ego depletion, a state of mental and emotional exhaustion from sustained self-control. After prolonged restriction, the brain generates a powerful counterimpulse. You've been good for so long. You deserve this. You work hard. You've been denying yourself. This one purchase won't hurt. And the purchase feels not like a failure of discipline, but like a deserved reward. A fair trade for all the restraint that preceded it. The trap is that deserving is not a financial calculation. It is an emotional one, and it is not bounded by what you can afford. The feeling of deserving is proportional to how long you've been restricting, not to how much is in your account, which means the more disciplined you've been, the stronger the counterimpulse becomes, and the more likely it is that a single emotional override will wipe out weeks of financial progress. This is one of the primary reasons why extreme budget restriction almost always fails as a long-term debt strategy. It generates the very psychological pressure that eventually produces a spending explosion. Emotional trap 4, the fresh start illusion. This one is less about a specific emotion and more about a specific cognitive pattern. It typically shows up as follows. You receive a windfall, a tax refund, a bonus, some unexpected money. Or you pay off a debt. Or you start a new month, a new year, a new quarter. And your brain reframes a moment as a fresh start, a clean slate, which temporarily reduces the psychological weight of existing debt and increases the sense of financial freedom. Research by behavioral economists Hung Chin Dai, Catherine Milkman, and Jason Reese, the same research that identified the fresh start effect in goal pursuit, found that people are significantly more likely to make financial resolutions and significantly more likely to break them around temporal landmarks that feel like new beginnings. The fresh start feeling is real and powerful. But it also generates a dangerous sense of permission, a feeling that the old rules don't fully apply in this new chapter, which often produces spending that quickly recreates a debt that was just cleared. The tax refund that pays off a credit card gets followed by charges that rebuild the balance within months. The bonus that clears a loan gets followed by lifestyle upgrades that generate new debt, not because the person is reckless, but because the emotional relief of clearing debt triggers a psychological state that is specifically fertile for new spending. Emotional trap 5, financial avoidance, the ostrich effect. This is the trap that most directly perpetuates debt through inaction, and it is the most misunderstood of the 5 because it looks, from the outside, like apathy or irresponsibility, but it almost never is. Financial avoidance, the tendency to not open bank statements, not check credit card balances, not look at debt totals, is primarily a stress and shame response, not a negligence response. Research by behavioral finance scholars Gal Zauberman and B. Q. Kim found that people avoid financial information specifically when they believe it will be bad, and that this avoidance is stronger among people who care most about their financial situation, not least. The more anxiety someone feels about their debt, the more likely they are to avoid the information that would tell them exactly how bad it is. The result is a debt situation that grows in the dark. Interest compounds on balances the person isn't tracking. Late fees accumulate on bills they're not opening. Minimum payments get missed on accounts they've mentally filed away. And the problem that was already significant becomes dramatically worse through a form of self-protective ignorance that was never designed to be self-destructive. It was designed to manage emotional overwhelm. Section 3. The shame spiral, the force that powers all 5 traps. Now, before we talk about solutions, I want to spend a few minutes on the force that connects all 5 of these traps and makes them harder to escape. That force is shame. Here's what most people don't realize about financial shame. It is not a motivating force. Every instinct says it should be. That feeling bad about debt should make you want to fix it. But the research on this is clear and consistent. Shame is not a driver of constructive behavior. It is a driver of avoidance, self-sabotage, and more of the exact behavior that generated the shame in the first place. Researcher Brené Brown, whose work on shame is among the most cited in social psychology, has consistently found that shame produces a predictable set of responses: withdrawal, hiding, and a desire to soothe the painful feeling as quickly as possible. For someone in debt, this means that the shame of looking at the balance makes them less likely to look at the balance, financial avoidance. The shame of having spent impulsively makes them more likely to spend again to escape the feeling, more stress spending. The shame of being in debt makes them feel fundamentally broken in a way that makes financial recovery feel impossibly out of reach, which produces hopelessness that feels like laziness from the outside. The shame spiral goes like this: spend emotionally, feel shame about the debt, feel too ashamed to look at the debt, feel worse about yourself. Spend, feel better, more debt, more shame, more avoidance, worse spending. Around and around. Breaking the shame spiral is not about discipline. It is about compassion. Specifically, self-compassion directed at the very financial behavior you most want to change. Research by Kristen Neff at the University of Texas, the leading researcher on self-compassion, found that people who respond to their own failures and mistakes with self-compassion rather than self-criticism are significantly more likely to acknowledge mistakes honestly, take corrective action, and maintain motivation through setbacks. Self-compassion is not weakness. It is a practical, evidence-based prerequisite for sustained behavior change. Section 4. The framework, breaking the emotional debt cycle. All right, let's build something actionable, because understanding the emotional architecture of debt is only useful if it leads to a different set of behaviors. Here's the framework I want you to work with. Step 1. Name the emotion before the purchase. This is the single most powerful intervention available, and it requires almost no resources. The practice is this: before any non-essential purchase, pause for 90 seconds and honestly identify the emotional state you're in. Not what you want, what you're feeling. Stressed? Bored? Lonely? Sad? Undervalued? Anxious? The reason this works is that spending under emotional distress is almost always unconscious. The purchase feels logical. I need this. I want this. This is reasonable, because the emotional driver is operating below conscious awareness. Bringing it into conscious awareness introduces a delay and a perspective that fundamentally disrupts the automatic spending response. Research in behavioral economics by Dragan Prelek and Duncan Simister found that the deliberate introduction of a decision pause, even a brief one, significantly reduces impulsive purchasing, particularly among high-stress consumers. The 90-second pause is not magical. It is neurological. It gives the prefrontal cortex enough time to come back online and evaluate the decision with something other than pure dopamine-seeking logic. Step 2. Build an emotional spending audit. For 1 month, track not just what you spend, but why you spend it. Create a simple log, the purchase, the amount, and one word describing your emotional state at the time. After 30 days, look for patterns. You will almost certainly find them. Spending clustered around particular days of the week, around particular emotional triggers, around particular relationships or situations, around particular times of day. These patterns are your actual budget problem, not the categories, not the numbers, the emotional triggers behind the numbers. Once you can see the patterns, you can design around them, which leads to the next step. Step 3. Design replacement behaviors for your specific triggers. This is not about willpower. It is about pre-committing to an alternative response before the trigger occurs. If your pattern shows stress spending after difficult work meetings, the intervention is designed before those meetings, a 10-minute walk immediately after, a brief phone call to a friend, a specific non-spending activity that delivers some of the same relief. The goal is not to eliminate the need for emotional regulation. The need is legitimate and human. The goal is to separate the emotional regulation from the spending. Research by implementation intention theorist Peter Gallwitzer found that people who pre-committed to specific if-then plans, if I feel the urge to spend after work, then I will do X instead, were significantly more successful at behavior change than those who relied on willpower alone. You don't need to be stronger. You need to be more prepared. Step 4. Treat your debt number with radical honesty and zero shame. This one is the hardest for most people. It requires opening the statements, looking at the actual balances, writing down the total, not to punish yourself, not to generate more shame, but because you cannot navigate to a destination you refuse to look at. The total is not a moral judgment. It is a coordinate, your current location on a map. And you need to know your current location before any navigation is useful. I want to suggest something specific. The first time you look at your full debt total, do it with the explicit understanding that you are gathering information, not conducting a character assessment. The number is data. What you do with the data from this moment forward is the only thing that matters. Step 5. Automate the debt payoff before your emotions can intercept it. This is where the financial and the psychological come together. Every technique we've discussed in previous videos, automation, same-day transfers, friction between you and your money, applies the debt payoff with equal force. Set up an automatic additional payment on your highest interest debt the day your paycheck arrives, before the emotional spending opportunities of the month can claim that money, before a stressful Tuesday can redirect it, before the I deserve this impulse can intercept it. The automated payment doesn't know about your emotional state. It doesn't care about the fresh start feeling or the retail therapy urge. It fires on schedule every time, regardless of how you're feeling. And that consistency, accumulated over months and years, is what actually clears the debt. Section 5. The math of emotional debt. What the cycle actually costs. Let me put a number on this because I think the math makes the urgency real in a way that the psychology alone sometimes doesn't. The average American household carries approximately $6,500 in credit card debt at an average APR of approximately 21%, according to the Federal Reserve's most recent consumer finance data. At minimum payments only, that debt costs approximately $9,200 in interest over roughly 14 years to fully clear on a $6,500 balance. But here's the number I want you to focus on. Research by consumer finance economists estimates that emotional spending, purchases driven primarily by emotional states rather than genuine need or planned desire, accounts for approximately 30 to 40% of total discretionary consumer spending. If we apply even a conservative 30% estimate to the monthly spending of a household that carries persistent credit card debt, the emotional spending component typically represents $200 to $400 per month in charges that are adding to the balance. $300 per month in emotionally driven charges on a credit card at 21% APR, if redirected instead to paying down a $6,500 balance, clears that debt in approximately 26 months, instead of 14 years. Instead of $9,200 in interest, the emotional spending is not just adding to the debt. It is the primary reason the debt persists. And here's what most people don't realize about that math. The $300 per month doesn't need to come from nowhere. It largely already exists in the budget. It's just currently flowing toward emotional purchases rather than debt payoff. The money is there. The emotion is intercepting it. Look, I want to close with something I think is genuinely important. If you are in persistent debt, if you've been cycling in and out of it for years, I need you to hear clearly that this does not mean you are bad with money. It does not mean you are irresponsible. It does not mean you lack discipline or intelligence or character. It almost certainly means that you have been trying to solve an emotional problem with financial tools, and that those tools, however well designed, were never built to address what's actually driving the behavior. The debt is not the root problem. The debt is the symptom. The root problem is the unmet emotional need, the unprocessed stress, the inherited money anxiety, the shame spiral, the coping mechanism that found spending as its expression. Addressing those things, honestly, compassionately, with real strategies rather than more willpower, is how the debt actually gets cleared and stays cleared. This is hard work. It is slower than a spreadsheet. It is less satisfying in the short term than a well-organized budget, but it is the only work that addresses the actual problem. And the people who do this work, who get honest about the emotional architecture of their financial behavior, almost universally report that the financial change follows naturally once the emotional foundation is addressed. Not easily, not overnight, but inevitably. You are not broken. You are responding in very human ways to very real pressures. And the fact that you're here, watching this, asking these questions, that is not a small thing. That is the beginning of the only kind of change that actually lasts. If this landed for you today, hit the like button. It helps more people find this content and have a conversation that most personal finance channels are afraid to touch. Subscribe if you haven't already, because every week we go deep on the psychology and the math of money together. And if you want to go further on the practical side, I got a video on how to build a fully automated debt payoff system so that the financial machine is running even when your emotional state isn't cooperating. That's the natural next step. It's linked right up here. I'll see you in the next one.